All right. Again, in some ways, I don't want you to accept anything wholeheartedly. Right? The goal of this class and any class I teach is to get you to think critically about everything you see, including visual images. Like I said before, one of the things I think we don't do is think as critically about visual images as we might with other images, right? You read an article, you're like, oh yeah, I believe this, I don't believe this doesn't make sense. But with visual images, we tend to accept things uncritically. And we want to avoid that. What I want to do is use this for practical purposes, right? We went through the first half of this already. I think there's a lot of the second half of this that fits this discussion that will be helpful for you for this exam and for thinking about the issues of the paper as well, particularly the notion of the Washington-Du Bois debate, how it is these images fit. We sort of left off talking about Washington's critics. Remember, Du Bois is not the only critic of Washington. He's probably the most famous, but he's not the only one. There are others that are going to become critical of Washington in parts of his program. And I think that they help you think about the program. Right? When you see what they're being critical of, it helps you, sort of brings into focus what it is Washington was advancing in terms of his ideas anyway. So Ida Wells, for example, later becomes very critical of Washington. Monroe Trotter, I mentioned him. He stands on a chair at one of Washington's talks, disrupts the proceedings, and gets thrown in jail. Right? He's very close with W.B. Du Bois. In fact, he's a major figure in the Boston area in the north. And then, of course, Du Bois. Right? Du Bois becomes the most outspoken, especially after his own publication, So It's a Black Vote. And what is it that Du Bois was objecting to? In many ways, it was Washington's view of education, right? Industrial education as the only model or the main model for African Americans. Du Bois had a problem with that. Not that he had a problem with industrial education, but he thought Washington's plan was too limiting for African Americans. Right? It ultimately would lock them into a certain position in society where they could only be sharecroppers, for example, and never aspire to anything more. At the precise moment where the rest of the country, and especially the South, is trying to modernize itself. So remember, we talked about how Reconstruction largely destroys the South. Right? There's something called the New South that's really in play here in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and early 1900s of how the South is going to modernize itself, how the South's kind of going to become more like the North. North wins the war, largely because of its industry, its factories, right? It can outproduce the South. In many ways, the South reformulates itself around that model. So you see the attempt to become more efficient in farming. Well, this fits perfectly with what Washington was talking about, right? Washington was saying, look, we need to increase the efficiency. And African Americans can do that. If we fill that role, then we'll fulfill an important role in this society and ultimately be accepted. Right? Now, part of the problem with this is there are going to be some shortcomings that maybe even Washington could not have predicted. For example, this same moment is going to be a moment where we see the mechanization of agriculture. So at the same time Washington is saying, learn to work with your hands and farm and this and that, pretty soon you're going to have machines come in and a whole bunch of sharecroppers lose their jobs and lose their land. If you can get a machine that can plow 1,000 acres, or a black family that can do 100 acres in the same amount of time, a lot of folks that had the money are going to choose the machine. So ultimately, the times are going to change maybe faster than Washington might have predicted. But it's interesting that he was very practical. He saw himself as fitting a moment and a people. He saw Du Bois, Washington saw Du Bois and others as kind of high in the sky. Yeah, that sounds nice. Those are great ideas, but you're talking about a tenth of the population. You're a northerner. What do you know about what's going on in Alabama? Washington saw himself as a realist. I live in Alabama. You're in Massachusetts, New York. You don't know nothing about this. If I say some of the stuff you say, I'll get lynched and we'll no longer have a school. So Washington really saw himself as a practical application of a lot of these ideas, and really as contributing to the greater good for this imagined community of African Americans. Du Bois and other critics are going to really have certain problems with that, around education, around how you attack the race problem, or should you attack the race problem. Du Bois and others are going to say that Washington is the Negro leader, but he was elected by white folks. Nobody asked black people who their leader was. He was kind of put in place, many would say. But again, you have millions of others that love Booker T. Washington and what he was able to accomplish and provide for, ultimately, many black people. So it's interesting to think about both sides of that. Remember, part of their criticism, many people's criticism of Washington, had not so much to do with his educational philosophy of industrial education, but maybe how he used his power. Yes, he becomes the leader, becomes the man, but how is he going to use that power that he has? I told you before, Washington was kind of ruthless with that power. When he felt like you were criticizing him and his program, he might take you out. His view was, look, I have the program, I'm trying to help millions of people, I can't let some Harvard-educated little dude mess that up. So when Du Bois and others gathered together and try to form the Niagara Movement, which was one of the early black organizations that's going to form in opposition to Booker T. Washington, Washington shuts them down. Washington calls all his friends at white newspapers and says, don't give this Niagara Movement any press, don't report on there, don't talk about them. I will shut them out. He makes various calls, hotels and whatnot, won't allow them to meet there, which is why they're going all the way to Canada, beyond Niagara Falls to meet, because they can't really find a place in the U.S. that's going to host them. Washington had that much power and was willing to use it. The Bois and others hate that. How are you going to smack them down? They would say, we're all trying to come up with solutions to the race problem. How are you going to smack us down? Washington says, look, I got the plan. I'm driving the train. If you're in the way, you're going to get run over. So it's interesting to think about this debate. Both of them feel like they have the solution to the race problem, the best solution to help African Americans. A lot of people have read this debate and seen shadows of it later on. We're going to talk after the break about the Great Migration, the move north. We're going to talk about people like Marcus Garvey. Very different ideas in some ways. Him and Du Bois kind of get into it, as we'll talk about. Some people have seen the Washington-Du Bois debate in Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Think about the sort of contours of that debate. On one level, you have Martin Luther King saying, look, we need integration, we need to fight for our rights. Many people saw Du Bois, a direct line there, right? Malcolm X, early on especially, Malcolm X is going to say, you know what, white society will never accept you. You need to get your own. It's about self-determination. Don't ask the government to do anything. You know they're not going to do anything. They're not going to protect you. Protect yourself. The Nation of Islam starts a number of black businesses. They say, look, the white society doesn't want you. You better create your own. Really create your own separate imagined community. It's interesting. We wouldn't normally think of a tie between, say, Washington and Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was very pro-black and African American in terms of thinking about history, right? In terms of making connections outside the U.S. Washington wasn't really on that, right? It was about being the best American you can be. Don't worry about the whole African American thing. So in certain ways, Malcolm X is more like Du Bois. But in many cases, especially on economic power, separation, Booker T. Washington was like, yeah, segregation is real, so build your own. It's interesting to think about echoes of this debate later on, although they're going to change. Again, we talked about the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement later on gets folded into the NAACP, which was formed in 1909, which is going to be an interracial movement. Black and whites sit down to form the NAACP after a major race riot. After a major race riot, the NAACP is formed. And actually, Du Bois is one of the few African Americans in leadership positions when it gets founded. It's mostly whites. It's a very interracial organization. Some say that there are, by this point even, two classes of African Americans. Sort of upper class and working class, or four even. Right? Some say, okay, maybe Du Bois' plan makes more sense for the upper classes, but Washington's plan makes more sense for the working classes. And maybe Washington might reach more people, because there are more in the working classes at this point than there are going to be in these upper classes or middle classes. So some say Du Bois is out of touch. He's only about the elites. Du Bois never felt like that was his thing. Others would criticize him that way. We'll talk about some of this. Black Exodus. We'll talk about this after the break as well. African Americans are already starting to leave the South in increasing numbers by the 1870s, 1880s. Some going north, some going west, some coming to urban areas rather than staying on the farm. This little trickle of people becomes a tidal wave of African Americans by World War I and World War II. To the 20th century, we're going to spend some time talking about what's called the Great Migration. African Americans leave the South in tremendous numbers. In fact, between 1910 and 1970, 6 million African Americans leave the South. So it goes from being 90% of black people living in the South to more than 50% of black people living outside the South in this period. Dramatic change, dramatic tipping point. Some say this allows things like the Harlem Renaissance. So we'll talk about black culture again and what it's going to look like, say, in the 1920s, especially as blacks come to represent themselves. What sorts of images should you put out there? When you can write a book, when you can paint a painting, what should you paint? Or when you can write a hip-hop song, what should your lyrics look like? Are you just an artist, or do you have this connection to a larger community? These are questions we're definitely going to revisit, right, in terms of more contemporary issues. Combating these old images, we're very familiar with that now, what these old images are. Many of you may have seen this painting. It's called The Banjo Lesson by Henry Tanner. If you haven't, you should Google it. It's really interesting. One of my favorite paintings by an important artist of the 1890s, Henry Osawa Tanner. He has some connection to both Washington and Du Bois as well. Studied in France, African-American artist. It's a very simple painting on some levels. It's a painting of a grandfather sitting in a rocking chair with his grandchild on his lap, and he's teaching him how to play the banjo. It's called The Banjo Lesson. So let's think about that piece of art. What larger message might a piece of art like that be sending? In a society where African-American men aren't supposed to be connected and care about their families, right? There's supposed to be no fathers, definitely not grandfathers, right? So it's interesting that Tanner would put out a message like that in this very famous poem, very famous painting, and many people are going to buy reproductions of this painting and have it in their homes even to this day. It says something about family without saying anything, right? More than any speech on some level. So we want to think about images and their importance. We talk about women. Black women always serve a very important role. Sometimes indirectly, they become significant. We'll talk about a couple of important entrepreneurs, people like Madam C.J. Walker. Some of you have ever heard that name, Madam C.J. Walker. She becomes particularly important in the early 1900s. First, black women millionaires. She gets big money, so we can think about Booker T. Washington. He says, look, develop a skill. Her skill was beauty. She's kind of known for straightening combs and beauty products for black women, which would also counter some of these images. Maybe in some ways question notions of beauty. So we'll talk about her a little bit more after the break as well. And she's going to make a good living on it. And she's going to hire and employ dozens and dozens of black women as salespeople. So she's really important economically speaking and also symbolically in terms of images of black people, particularly black women, black banks. Right? And we found the black bank is self-determination. Churches obviously are continually important in this era. Mutual benefit societies, fraternal orders, sororities. You think it's a coincidence that many of the fraternities and sororities are founded in this period? 1890s, early 1900s, 1906, 7, 10. Right? It's a lot of it has to do with self-determination, doing things for yourself, helping the community. I fit very much in this debate, in this discussion, especially working from inside the community and not expecting certain things from outside the community. It's interesting to think about, again, how all this stuff could be reread in different ways in considering this larger debate. This era is also called Women's Era, especially by the 1890s. Women are doing a number of things, both white and black women, are pushing for the right to vote massively by the 1890s, early 1900s. And as we know, black women are always going to be essential to the black community and to the uplift of women's communities. They sort of serve multiple roles. In some ways, they're going to adopt feminist ideas, but in some ways, feminism doesn't fit them. Right? Black women weren't necessarily concerned with pushing for the right to work outside the home. They already were doing that. Right? That comes to be seen as a white feminist thing. Many of them are trying to get back in the home. I want to take care of my own kids rather than taking care of white children like Mammy had to do. So it's interesting to think about how their goals may compete in some ways. The club movement, club women's movement, and particularly this next slide, the NACW, National Association of Colored Women, fits this discussion. Part of one of the branches founded here in D.C. In fact, 1892, and Julia Cooper and others are going to found what later joined with the NACW. Mary Trish Terrell is another D.C. figure. How do you uplift the community? How do you paint a better picture of them? Clean them up. A lot of the ideologies are going to have to do with uplift and cleaning up, especially the poor, working class folks, to present a better middle class image. Some folks will have problems with that. Why do you got to change working class folks? But again, in some ways, it very much fits this Washington Du Bois debate. That you're being judged, so you need to present yourself a certain way. Mary Trish Terrell, this is an image of her. She's not wearing booty shorts, right? because she knew that black women were being interpreted certain ways. In fact, the NACW was founded after a white newspaper editor said some horrible things about black women, basically being hoes. And they come together, they respond to this, and there's this major call, and all these women come together to challenge those images. So it's interesting to think about that. We'll talk about some more of this stuff later on. Sports. How does sports fit this? Another thing we'll talk about after the break. Right? Sports figures. Very much about popular culture. Now, LeBron is not just a black hero, right? Folks consume him from everywhere. What does he have to do and say? Does he have to do and say anything? Some athletes embrace that. Some athletes say that's not for me. Charles Barkley said, I'm not a role model. My parents should do that. LeBron has come to feel like he is in some ways. Maybe embrace that role. Someone like a Chuck Johnson, who we'll talk about, first black heavyweight champion. Right? He wins the heavyweight title. Think about the time period. Folks are getting lynched for looking at white men and white women. Wrong. This dude is in the ring knocking them out. He wasn't allowed to fight for the title for many years because it was seen as too dangerous for blacks to even be given an opportunity to win this title, which was then seen as kind of the strongest man in the world, was how they called the heavyweight title. It's back before MMA, right? It's back when boxing was it. And he gets his chance and knocks folks out. Not only was he knocking white men out, and there are race riots after many of his fights, folks died cheering for Jack Johnson. Not only was he knocking white men out, he was dating white women. Married a couple white women. Didn't get lynched, surprisingly. And Washington and Du Bois actually both commented on him, as we'll talk more about. He's a really interesting figure that we'll get into after the break, so don't forget about him. So how does sports, how does this fit into popular culture? Okay, so how do we take all this and put it into practical terms? How does this fit this paper, and how does it fit into this chapter? I want to open up the comments I wrote to you today, if possible, real quick. I tried to summarize an answer to several questions I had received about the paper, particularly the paper prompt and how you should be looking at this paper prompt. I keep saying it's a prompt, right? It's supposed to prompt you to developing a certain argument, and that's what I mean. It's purposely general and specific at the same time. It's supposed to be general enough that all arguments can fit within it. Everybody's responding to the same overall question, right? Is he a sellout or a savior? But there are specific points in there that you're supposed to go through and use to develop your specific argument, your specific thesis. What does that mean? One of the questions I got was, is this two separate papers? Because the prompt itself is kind of organized in two parts. No, it's one paper. The first part of the prompt, we'll look at that in a second. Ask you to go into Washington's philosophy, Washington's program. The second part of the prompt looks at Du Bois as a critic of Washington. Right? And what do the criticisms of Washington's program tell you about his program? Right? How does that help you answer the question as to whether you think he's a sellout or a savior? I don't care about your opinions. Opinions are great. In fact, I want you to have them. You should have your own independent opinion. I may disagree with me completely. But how do you support it? How do you make an argument? Your thesis? A thesis is simply an answer to a research question. Scientists have a hypothesis. If you're a chemist, you go into the lab, you're like, I think if I mix calcium and nitrogen together, it might explode. That might be the hypothesis when you walk into the lab to test it through your research. They mix it up and they go, oh, it didn't blow up. We thought it would blow up and it didn't. I need to change my hypothesis because what I thought would happen didn't. You may write your paper with one thesis and get to the end, you're like, I changed my mind about whether he's a sellout or a savior based on my own evidence. It's about evidence and examples. That's how you make your case. Like I said in here, it is one essay. The prompt is supposed to prompt you to develop your specific thesis statement. The overall question that everyone's kind of starting with, and everybody has the same starting point. Not everybody has the same ending point. So think of it that way. The starting point is he a sellout or a savior? Is he a sellout or a savior? The ending point is up to you and how you read the evidence and your views. So whether it's a savior or a second part, and references are critical, as I said, specific in general, everyone's technically writing the same prompt, and broad enough to allow you to explore your own options, yet it raises several points and asks several specific follow-up questions, which I'm about to prompt. Overall, your thesis statement is going to do multiple things. Your thesis is, again, an answer to a question. The general question you're answering is he a sellout or a savior? That answer is up to you. Right? But so what? Why is that important? You're telling me whether it's a sellout or a savior. You're telling me why it's important in your view. Just like you're doing with the IDs. Remember, the IDs are just basic information, but so what? Why is it important? What does it tell us? Does it tell us something about the time period, or tell us something about race, or African American history, or imagined community, tipping point? We started off the class with these theories and with these tools for a reason. That's why the prompt starts off with, remember, imagined community and tipping point. How might those concepts come into this discussion? That may come into your thesis. Maybe you feel like Washington was talking to a very specific imagined community. Maybe Du Bois was talking to another. Be thinking analytically, be thinking about making an argument. All I do up here every day, besides talk too much, is give you my opinion on stuff. I read the same stuff as you. I read the same stuff as countless other historians. I have my own interpretation of it. Sometimes I may agree with the textbook. Sometimes you notice I'll go way off of the textbook. It's about my interpretation, which I try to support with examples and evidence of various types. But you may disagree with that. That's what historians do. They argue among each other. That's how we actually learn. There are more than 200 books written on the subject of slavery. Wow! Don't you just need one book on slavery? No. Right? Historians disagree with each other all the time. And they evaluate each other's arguments and evidence. So your thesis has to answer a question, tell me why it's important, and then how are you going to demonstrate it specifically in this paper? If you write a good thesis statement, the rest of the paper should write itself. If you answer the question, have in your mind and actually say it, why it's important, what it tells us in a larger sense, and how, what specific examples you're going to talk about that illustrate why it's important. Your paper will write itself. All right, you got an introduction, a thesis statement, the rest of it is your examples and your evidence. Then you conclude. All right, this is why it's important, this is what I proved. So if you have a good thesis statement, or a specific thesis statement, it will help you. This is also one of the reasons I say 3-4 pages. In the past, I didn't put a limit on it. People gave me 12, 15 pages. This is a huge topic. It makes you be focused, right? That means your thesis statement has to be focused. You only have time to talk about 3-4 key themes, probably. You can't talk about everything that Washington and Du Bois were talking about. It's a long 20-year debate. Yes? Your answer, each individual will have their own answer as to whether he's a sellout or a savior. The rest of the thesis is supporting that. So he's a sellout because he didn't talk about lynching, this is significant for this reason. I'm going to talk about this, this, and this to prove that. He's a savior. Again, you can make whatever argument you want to make. Historians still disagree over whether he's a sellout or a savior. It's up to you. But the reason why I focus so much attention on the thesis is because that organizes everything else. Right? Organizes everything else in the paper. Essentially, will write itself once you have a thesis that you can use. That tells you how you answer that question, why it's important, and then how you're going to demonstrate it in this. How you going to prove that in these 3-4 pages? You can't talk about everything. You shouldn't try. There are whole books about Booker T. Washington. There's a 2-volume set on Du Bois that's more than 1,500 pages long. Right? So how are you supposed to do it in 3 pages? It's very specific in terms of what you're choosing to talk about. And why. So it is your opinion, yeah, but it's about how you support your opinion. Right? I don't care what your opinion is. I don't rate you on your opinion because I have my own. What I tend to find is often people do better when they disagree with me. Why do you think that might be the case? Because I'm wrong? No, that's probably not. But it's probably because when you know someone disagrees with you, you support your opinions better. You're standing outside arguing with a friend of yours about the NCAA tournament. You're like, Kentucky not going to win. Right? Your friend's like, they haven't lost all year. They smashed everybody. They're going to win. No, they're not going to win because Wisconsin has that one dude, or Arizona. You have to have evidence. Otherwise, you're just talking. We tend to have better evidence when we know people disagree with us. You should assume that your reader disagrees with you, or that your reader doesn't know enough about Washington to make that determination. That's why you need introduction. That's why you need this background information about who he was and what he did. So looking at the prompt, right quick. Again, think about how this is a prompt for your argument. Am I going to go down this list with your paper and look at, oh, she didn't answer second part, number 3, you failed. No, not what I do. I ain't got time for that. I ain't got time for that. If you don't cover everything that's in there, it's a problem, right? But this is not a checklist. It's about developing your argument and you making your argument as strongly as possible. One more thing. This last one, number 4 on the second part says, how would Ida Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, C.J. Walker, Jack Johnson deal with this? How do they fit this debate? Women, in particular, fit this debate. Chapter 13 spends a lot of time talking about, especially black women. People like Charlotte Brown. She actually comes up even in the Rise and Fall of Jim Crow video, how she combined both for her school for black women. But that really was more about getting you to think about the future. Maybe in your conclusion, you can raise issues about how this debate outlasts, the time period or whatever. It's something we're going to come back to. I don't expect you to spend a whole lot of time on that part because we haven't really gotten there yet. Right? I just mentioned some of the people that I've met, T.J. Walker, Jack Johnson. But you should be thinking about these connections that ultimately play out there. But it's up to you. You use this to prompt yourself. Prompt your argument and develop your argument, which you then prove. Assume I don't agree with you. Assume I don't know as much as you do on this particular subject. This is your argument, not mine. Your argument, not mine. Questions about that? I know there's some questions because some of you have sent me good ones via email. Anything else unclear about that?
Does your argument have to be like
Not necessarily. It's up to you. Just use that prompt as a starting point. Where you end up, it's up to you. It's up to you. Usually when people write books, in fact, they often write the introduction last. Historians, I'm writing a book right now, and the introduction will probably be the last thing that I write, because you sometimes don't know where it's going to end up, right? You start with a hypothesis. Sometimes you get into the evidence and reading these primary sources. Maybe you go back and watch Rise and Fall. Maybe you watch some stuff in ethnosis today that change your mind. You write, including, various things. Well, what about this and that? You should talk about this. By the end, you're like, I believe something different now. There's nothing wrong with that. All you do is go back and modify your thesis. Your thesis should fit your evidence. But starting usually is the hardest part. That's really what the most difficult thing about writing is. Where do you start? That's one of the reasons why sometimes it's good to write the introduction last or the setup last. In terms of your introductions, they can save you a lot of time and space. An introduction is kind of like an identification. You can lay out a lot of the who, what, when, where, background, context. Tell us about Booker T. Washington and his background, especially if that's going to be relevant to your argument. Right? When is he around? Right? Where does he live? Do you think that's significant? His where as opposed to Du Bois' where. You get a lot of that stuff out of the way in the introduction before you can get to your thesis statement. So don't assume your reader knows everything about the subject, and don't assume your reader believes you and agrees with you. That will lead you to make a better argument. Other questions? Other thoughts? Is this helpful or no?
I got a question about the man you take online, when you're doing the writing part. So you still like writing on the paragraph or something like that?
Identifications?
Yeah.
Yeah, you would have to write those in a paragraph and just submit it to a Dropbox. They're not automatically graded or anything like the multiple choice would be. I still got to go through the grading online. So just turn it in as like a Word document, essentially like you would for the essay. I'm going to put a Dropbox up for the essay too, although a couple people have given me their hard copy drafts. But you have till Thursday if you wanted to modify stuff between now and then. You can do that. Yeah. Which one? The Washington Du Bois hangout? I don't know if I have any here. If not, they're all on the blackboard under the Washington Du Bois folder inside course module 1. I don't think I have any more with me. Yeah, I don't have any more with me right now. Any questions? How many of you are planning on showing up to actually take it in person? So I know how many people to expect. I gotta be here regardless, so it don't matter. Okay. All right. Okay. Enjoy yourself. Be safe on your vacations too. If I'm not gonna see you on Thursday, come back refreshed, ready to work. You're gonna hit the ground running. Yeah. Huh? But what's the handout? Somebody handout? Under, I'll start you right now. Under start here. Course module 1. Assume this is working. Make sure it's there. I had a couple things that I thought y'all could see. Course module 1. Washington Boys debate. Huh? What was under extra? Yeah, the Selma extra credit is going to be up until May, until the last class. Especially if they're on campus. Is that what you're at? These are the dropouts for the extra credit. Have you come up? What were you talking? You talking about that handouts, right? Yeah. Washington the Boys debate handout. Yeah. We start here. Course module 1. Make sure it's there. Stuff happens. Yeah, it's in the card. This is the handout and this is the paper form.
Well, I needed to know was if you put the test online, I have until like Wednesday night to do it.
Yeah, at least 4 hours. No problem.
You take it online, Facebook,
No. That's actually, yeah, that's actually good because we still have a class. If you have a problem, let me know. You already anticipate you have a problem?
No,
You never have problems. Yeah, right. Yeah, no problem. Let me know if that was the case. Mm-hmm. Second pencil. I think that's the. You bring that up.
You said you already dropped it off?
Hmm?
I think I dropped it to
You released the thing yesterday. It was not good.
This for sports?
Yeah.
What sport? Tennis team? In a bowling team?
This year, the tennis team.
I saw you guys have open practices coming up. I'm gonna come. Heckle y'all. I'm coming. I wanted to come actually. I haven't been to a game yet, so I want to come to a game too. What position?
Linebacker.
Okay. No problem. When will let me get up tonight with some folks. I'm up by 6 tonight. I can't do it right now, stuff, but get up by tonight.